Hi there. Alongside Tami, I'm Dr. Rob, and you're listening to Dental Formulator's Playbook. Today, we're going to cover another hot topic, nano hydroxyapatite, nano HAP, things like that. What is going on with nano HAP and the messaging flying around social media and among some companies and researchers? There's a lot to unpack here, and so we're going to split this into two parts, right? And in this part one, we're going to address how the teeth get demineralized and remineralized. And then in part two, we're going to give a little bit more concrete examples of at least one of the products in the marketplace that has been tested and things like that. But before we have to do that, we have to understand the basics of
Makes
how do
sense.
teeth get demineralized and how do they get remineralized. All this is super important.
Fluoride can't catch a break.
No, you can't.
It seems to be the target, but based on water fluoridation levels and what we know about topical fluorides, this doesn't seem to be warranted. Am I missing something?
No, you're not. For water fluoridation, at least here in the US with community water supplies, i.e., not your own freshly drilled water well, which we don't know what the fluoride level is, there is little cause for a major public health concern. Remember, as Paracelsus originally taught, it is the dose that makes the poison.
Well, right, because you get more fluoride per event in green tea, right?
Yeah, that's right. At least three times as much. So if it is a concern, that needs to be published and pushed elsewhere, not water fluoridation.
So what about fluoride in toothpaste?
Well, as long as you're not ingesting it, you're not eating it, this shouldn't be an issue.
So kids under 6 should be supervised anyway during a toothbrushing event, especially if they're using a fluoride toothpaste.
Yeah, that's right. Parents and caregivers must be responsible with young children. Don't let them be independent with such products. And this is just a general comment. And kids can certainly rinse their mouth with water after brushing if there are any lingering issues about fluoride ingestion.
Okay, but all this talk about hydroxyapatite, HAP, nano HAP, etc. This is being messaged as a fluoride replacement.
Yes, unfortunately, social media blitzes us with how well nano HAP can work. But we need to review this because relative to fluoride, this hasn't been studied with much rigor. I mean, the source and dosing for nano HAP remains uncertain, and there are different sizes of nano HAP or even HAP ranging from micron sizes down to nano sizes. Heck, there are even different shapes and synthetic processes.
So there's a lot of unknowns.
Yes, and we need to get this straight. Regarding hydroxyapatite for use in the mouth, whether it's micro-sized or nano-sized, it doesn't matter. The marketers, promoters, and sometimes researchers are taking advantage of consumers. That means you and me, anybody listening here, there are lack of knowledge of how tooth remineralization and demineralization occur.
So you mean how teeth get weakened and then how they get repaired?
Yes, exactly. So to understand if HAP or nano HAP even work, we need to first understand how teeth get weakened or demineralized, right?
Yes.
Okay. So tooth softening or weakening, demineralization, all of those are kind of interchangeable. You have weakening, softening, demineralization that occurs largely through acid attack. And there's a couple different ways to get that acid attack. One way is through pathogenic bacteria. You see, whenever the bacteria feeds on the sugars or fermentable carbohydrates, they produce acids, and the acids will lead to the tooth decay. So that is one way, microbial, derived acids. Tooth decay is also synonymous, as we talked about, with caries. But there's another way, and that's through dental erosion. And that's without the intervention of bacteria. That's just through from the dietary acids. For instance, I mean, there can also be other behavioral stuff too, regurgitations and stuff of the body, but let's just focus on the diet. So things that you eat or drink, and that could be whether you eat orange or drink orange juice, whether you drink wine, if you have candies, right? If you drink sports drinks, soda, things like this, anything that has probably an acidic environment denoted by the pH. So usually if it's less than 5.5, you're going to have demineralization of the enamel anyway, whether it's from the diet or whether it's from the microbes causing it. But then you're also going to have the condition where, there's, any kind of chelating agent. Sometimes a lot of these candies and stuff, they have these sour flavors, and that's driven by like tartaric acid, citric acid. We love these things, but those actually grab onto the calcium and pull it with quite vigor. That it's easy to have that demineralization from the teeth. So either acids just from diet, including foods, drinks, or the acids produced by the microbes.
Yeah, Jolly Ranchers did a number on my teeth. So how do you get back the lost enamel? And can this even be done?
Well, early tooth decay situations, again, with acids that are generated by bacteria, they can create small holes, essentially. Porous structure. I mean, our enamel's already porous. They make it bigger, and then there's loss of mineral. Those are usually called white spot lesions, early lesions, if they're just in the enamel. If that penetrates into the underlying dentin, well, now you have a cavity, and that's going to necessitate intervention. But that could be healed as long as it hasn't penetrated into the dentin. You can arrest that with fluoride and maybe some other agents too if you combine that. But you first need to arrest it and then have that remineralize. Our saliva does that, and there's also some other combination products and other strategies.
So what about erosion?
Yeah, so erosion, and this is the hallmarks of this, right? So you don't really get necessarily a hole. It's not like a empty, Tupperware container, a bowl shape that has a lid on it, right? That would characterize maybe a white spot lesion. Erosion is a little bit different. Although there can be some surface lesions, some gaps, some demineralized subsurface in the enamel, usually you're talking about the overall thinning of enamel. So if you start with enamel and you eat a lot of Jolly Ranchers or candies, all of a sudden you can have 20% thinner enamel depending on how
Wow.
much you like those Jolly Ranchers. And once that thins, it's really challenging to get that mineral back. In essence, you don't. The best thing you can hope for is arresting, like stopping further loss. So you got to stabilize that surface. And then maybe some remineralization can occur, but it's not like you're going to grow back. If you lost 20% of your enamel, you're not going to get 20% enamel. You might get maybe, and I'm being, very optimistic here, right? Maybe you get 0.5% back if you arrest it and then you remineralize it, And again, that's just ballpark. I don't have any evidence of that, but I do know you don't, have thicker enamel after you've already had tremendous dental erosion, experience.
Okay. So hydroxyapatite, nano or otherwise, cannot grow back an
Yeah,
enamel.
no, it can. And we know this, right? Even if you don't have any demineralization, it's not like you already have existing tooth structure and then that structure is getting thicker, and then you keep on using nano HAP paste or any other product that can promote remineralization. And all of a sudden we have thicker enamel as we age. Doesn't happen. Has never happened. So there's a lot of history there to show us that. It's not like you're going to continue to get bigger teeth or bigger, thicker enamel. No, you can't. They're claiming it maybe. In some of these social media things, they say, "Hey, get it back, and you can, it reacts quickly, and all this calcium is great for the teeth." No, there is no data. And if there was data, I would like, why hasn't that been submitted as like a new drug application, for instance? Where's the proof of this? Has anybody seen this?
Like osteoporosis pharmaceutical drugs that strengthen bones.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
Okay, so nanohydroxyapatite is claiming it can repair the teeth instantly or overnight
Yeah.
in some social media posts. It says it can fill in gaps,
Yeah.
whiten teeth, and remove oral bacteria. And they say it's natural. What's going on?
Yeah, there's a lot there, right? So first, our teeth are not made of pure hydroxyapatite, whether that's nano or whatever. It's not. They're based on carbonate apatite, which is kind of a version of hydroxyapatite. It's just that hydroxyl groups in that structure have been replaced by carbonate groups. That means that they're going to be a little bit more susceptible to becoming weakened,
Okay.
demineralized. The hydroxyl groups and the carbonate groups, if those are the initial species, the ionic species that are being lost from the tooth, well, then that needs to be replaced. Whenever they become lost, the phosphate loses and then the calcium, and it's like this. I don't want to say it's like a domino effect, but it kind of is. Usually, demineralization isn't just attacking only one of the species, and you're not losing intact whole crystals of apatite, nano-sized or not. It's just Demineralization is messy. It doesn't work that way. It can be pretty predictable over time, but in these individual events, no, it's messy with all the different enamel types and variations. Where's it at in the mouth? There's other biological factors that affect this. And there's a reason why the apatite is, we call it maybe not natural, because nobody's wandering around brushing their teeth with powdered human or animal bones and teeth. I mean,
Mm-mm.
that would be really, I mean, if you really want to have the natural, apatite like mineral, and if you're going to try to do that, that is one thing that we're doing, but nobody's doing that. So maybe they did it in the past, but these things are synthesized. And while they might have some similarities, because they do, apatite is a known mineral. It has a known structure on Earth. I mean, there's apatite mineral even outside of the body, right? But in our body, you have calcium phosphate. There's lots of analogs, but usually with the analogs, especially for teeth, you're going to have these hydroxyl groups and these carbonate groups. So even if they wanted to say the nanohydroxyapatite is perfect match for the tooth, it's false because our teeth are not like that.
Well, so this explains the wide variation in size, shape, source,
Oh my God.
etc.
Yeah. So some of the sources, so there's one manufacturer that actually sources their calcium from eggshells. So eggshells have calcium carbonate. So they get the eggshells and they treat it and they have to, because calcium carbonate is not soluble, doesn't dissolve well, they have to first digest it in acids to get their calcium. But that's pretty common. If you're not using like calcium chloride or another type of calcium, you still got to treat it and get your calcium. And then the industry, what they do is they blend it with either phosphate salts or phosphoric acid and then precipitate the nano hydroxyapatite according to whatever parameters they want. You can control size, you can control, obviously shape. So if you see like, hey, 50 nanometers or 100 nanometers or 2 nanometers or rod shape versus sphere, there's all these, really you're going to get a distribution anyway. It's really hard to just get one particular size. And if you do get one particular size, that means that it's a highly controlled process. Usually cost is going to get involved and you're going to be paying a premium on that ingredient. The blitz and social media on the nanohydroxyapatite in the market, they're not paying super high premiums to make sure they have perfect, all the time, size and shape.
Right. So which HAP or nano HAP is the best then?
Well, it's funny. If you were in the 80s, it'd be regular HAP, micron size. But now that there's been advancements and they've been able to reduce the size of the HAP2 nano size, and now that's pretty much, well, done. I mean, there's a lot of different manufacturers that could do that. Now it's a nano HAP. So if it was HAP before, that's fine. Well, now this is the new thing.
Okay, well, how old is the HAP technology?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. So the original use of the HAP, just hydroxyapatite, not nano, but just regular size, which is going to be the micro size, for use in topical dental formats like a toothpaste, was commercialized in the 1980s by the Sanji company in Japan. They have two major brands, Apadent and Apagard. They began using a medical grade of hydroxyapatite in the mid 90s, and this helped secure their anti tooth decay clearance in the Japanese market. In the early 2000s, they reduced the medical grade HAP size to the nano sizes and then continued to market heavily in and around Asia. And, it's funny because in 2006, I remember meeting the company's founder's wife at a conference in Australia. I believe that was in 2006, and she was presenting some data, and I remember that. But I think that originally what even got them into that, even going back before the 90s and the 80s, NASA had filed a patent for the creation of tooth mineral hydroxyapatite, and I think that the Sanji company maybe licensed that technology. But
NASA, as in the space agency.
and we can discuss that, for another time. Just to let you know, they have worked on some other new things. But anyway, yeah, but that's for another
Different
conversation.
podcast, it sounds like. So you got to meet the company's founder's wife, the Sanji company.
Yes,
I bet that was super
it was
interesting.
interesting for sure.
Anyway, now there are many different types, right?
Yep.
So that still hasn't answered my question.
Yeah, well, you know what? There's another company that's based out of Portugal named Fluid Nova. Fluid Nova, we're going to be talking about them also in part two of this podcast, but they actually do have nano-sized versions, but they offer their raw material, nanohydroxyapatite, in either powder or slurried formats so that you could, instead of just trying to put the powder into a formulation, which can be challenging because see all these nano sizes, these are very fine particles. They like to agglomerate, they like to bunch up. And although you start with nano sizes, they might become macro sized by the time they all aggregate and tie in with each other. So they say, well, we'll have slurries that you can readily add to your mouthwash or your
Mm.
toothpaste, things like this. So that's one example. You also have Japanese sources, like I talked about, with the eggshell, derived nanohydroxyapatite. There's also other manufacturers, including world recognized, like wide one, Omnia. Omnia, they serve both healthcare and non-healthcare applications, and they do a lot of work and have done a lot of work with calcium carbonates. They usually mine that and then they purify it after they mine the calcium carbonate, but they can also synthesize it too. And they have actually created hybrid materials with both calcium carbonate and nanohydroxyapatite. They slightly vary the ratios according to if they want to have remineralization or if they want to have sensitivity. So that's yet another example.
Okay. Again, I'm hearing so many different options,
Yeah.
but do they any of them actually work?
Yeah, and that's really what we need to get to, This is a loaded question. I do believe they may work as an abrasive because it's an insoluble agent. And anytime you have an insoluble agent, you put it to your toothpaste, think of like whatever your silicas are, your calcium carbonate. Sometimes people use kaolin clays. There's different types of abrasives, and those are meant for cleaning. Those are meant for cleaning the teeth. And so I do think that it can probably be used for instance, as an abrasive like material to help clean the teeth. If you clean the teeth, you're obviously removing some of the staining that is naturally trapped into the pellicle layer. Usually that's a protein rich layer that always coats our teeth. So as long as we're salivating properly, we're going to have that pellicle that sits on the teeth. So you have like the enamel, then you have the pellicle, and then you have the biofilms with all the different bacteria.
Okay.
So if the stains are not in the biofilm, which are going to get disrupted if you have a manual toothbrush or even electric toothbrush, especially, then you get down to the pellicle. And if you remove that, well, the pellicle can trap those stains from coffee, from tea, from, a blueberry icing cupcake or something. And so you can get removal of that. And so will that be as a good as a whitening agent as some of these other ones? Maybe not, but you're going to get at least some whitening benefits. Absolutely. If you consider whitening to be the removal of that stain from that pellicle and stuff. And the industry does recognize that. So,
Okay. So basically, you're telling me from an abrasive point of view, you can definitely see the logic there and how it would work.
yep.
Whitening, maybe. What about remineralization?
Yeah, remineralization, we need to talk about that. So, upon immediate use, no. I'm going to be pretty emphatic here. There is no remineralization benefit. Somebody may say, oh, it might get trapped in the defects of the teeth. Well, that's trapping, and that's not actual true remineralization
Because it doesn't integrate.
because it doesn't integrate. For remineralization to occur, you need ions, you need calcium ions, you need phosphate ions. That is so important. But hydroxyapatite doesn't have any ions. It's a solid, particle, insoluble, right? It's a crystal, right?
No ions.
Yeah, so this is one of the reasons why we talk about fluoride in terms of fluoride toothpaste. We don't use the elemental form fluorine because fluorine is stable. Fluoride is the ionic form, and that is what reacts with the two structure. In fact, we talked about earlier the hydroxyl groups and the carbonate groups that get lost. Well, those are negatively charged. And you can replace those with fluoride. That's a isomorphic substitution is what it's called. The fluoride immediately just goes wherever the hydroxyl group was or the carbonate group was. And so it immediately arrests it and stabilizes it. Hydroxyapatite, nano or not, does not contribute ions immediately upon use.
Therefore, it can't basically supplant or take the place like
That's right.
fluoride might with their because fluoride has the ions.
Yeah, it's not in the reactive form, in other
Okay.
words. So it makes you wonder, huh?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So how do you think that nano HAP works, right? Isn't that the next question?
Well, how do they think it works?
Well, there's two
That's the
different,
question.
yeah, there's two different tacks here, right? First, the commercially rampant approach is that they think our teeth are like Legos or Minecraft pieces where the nano HAP simply fits or snaps into place, right? That's absolutely wrong. It doesn't happen like that. This is not any, you're not building microchips here, right? This isn't like epitaxy where you're trying to build semiconducting materials or chips in the industry, like for a computer, for
Mhm.
our microelectronic devices, where you just deposit layer upon layer. That's what they want you to think, but that's not how integration, true remineralization occurs in the mouth. It does not happen that way. You need ions. So I think that that is blatantly incorrect. But there is another way. The other tack here is that maybe the HAP, the nano HAP, maybe it gets trapped somewhere in situ in the mouth. Maybe it gets trapped in the saliva, in the cheek, and in your gum tissue, between the teeth, in the crevices of your teeth. I don't know. Maybe even on the tongue. And maybe it sits there. Maybe it just sits there and acts as a reservoir for when a future acid attack occurs. Maybe through drinking a sports drink. Maybe, I don't know, eating something. Or maybe bacteria finding some poorly cleaned, fermentable carbohydrate, like, I don't know, like bread or cookies, I don't know, whatever, stuck in the teeth that hadn't been cleaned out. And then it starts to slowly digest that and then it produces acids. When those acids are then created, it'll break down the HAP and it'll
Okay.
release then the HAP's calcium and phosphate.
Okay.
That is more believable.
I can see the logic in that. So, but the first thing you said basically is the size and shape have absolutely
Exactly.
nothing to do with remineralization,
Yep.
which means because it doesn't have the ions, you're telling me there's absolutely no immediate remineralization effect from using the nano HAP.
Yeah, that's right. So calcium ions and fat phosphate ions are naturally derived from our saliva. So our saliva is our natural, biologically friendly remineralization source.
It has a purpose.
It's the original one. I mean, that's one of the reasons why we salivate, and that's one of the reasons why our saliva contains, oh, by the way, calcium ions and phosphate ions. Our saliva is not contributing perfect, intact nano-hydroxyapatite clusters that are somehow going to smack against the tooth and just sit there and then eventually integrate. It doesn't work that way. And again, this is one of the reasons why fluoride is so effective. It's an ion, it's small, it replaces direct species that have already been lost in the tooth structure, like the hydroxyl and carbonate groups.
So the bottom line, if I'm hearing correctly, is nano HAP doesn't have any ions like fluoride. Fluoride has ions, but it doesn't have any ions. Therefore, it can't be in the
That's
right
right.
format
Yeah,
when
that's
it
right.
comes to remineralization.
Yeah, that's right. It's not a replacement for fluoride.
Okay. They say it's a replacement for fluoride.
I know that's what they say, but it's not. You know, one of the advantages of fluoride is not only does it react super fast, but it also creates fluorapatite. And fluorapatite is much more acid resistant than hydroxyapatite or carbonate apatite, nanohydroxyapatite, whatever. Fluoride attracts also calcium and phosphate from saliva to stimulate the formation of that acid resistant fluorapatite mineral. Because nano HAP is not in ionized form, it cannot integrate directly, at least upon immediate use. I mean, it just won't be able to do that. If you have a reservoir, that is more believable. And so, again, that's what we're talking about. Demineralization in general is not perfect. In bulk erosion, it does occur where lots of enamel layers can be lost. Heck, even into the dentin, whenever even an endodontist prepares your tooth, or even the general dentist, if he's going to prepare your tooth for any kind of restorative work, they always have to etch away enamel in order to get rid of the decay, number one, but also give it a nice clean surface for which they can then,
Makes sense.
perform their operation, right? You want good bonding agents to be, well bonded to the tooth structure. That is, some of the examples of where, you would have examples of bulk, thinning of enamel or
Hmm.
removal of enamel to actually prep the surface. But in general, if somebody doesn't salivate very well, which that can happen with different medicines or therapies and such, they can have thinner enamel by the time they're 25 years old. If they've always grown up with that, if their permanent teeth came in, I mean, they could already have thin enamel by that time. And then, of course, it just continues on. One of the great rewards for aging and for living a healthy life is that eventually, some of our gum tissue can actually, pull away from the root of our tooth and we could have that exposure. That's why sensitivity becomes more of a problem. Periodontitis becomes more of a problem, maybe gingivitis as we continue to age. So, these are the kinds of things that we need to think about. But microscopically, what I'm saying is the demineralization is not uniform. It's unpredictable. Sometimes it'll occur at the center of the tooth crystal. Like if you were to imagine a hexagon shape, and that's an apatite crystal, sometimes it'll be right in the middle. Sometimes it'll be around the boundaries where it interfaces with another one of these crystals. Researchers have seen this. They've seen this. You can use scanning electron microscopy. You can use other methods, transmission electron microscopy. There's different ways of looking at that. I've even looked at that. One reason that this isn't uniform is because our biological tissue, our enamel, is not uniform for each and every tooth, each and every surface, right? There's going to be some of these differences. And in addition to that, how we clean those surfaces and what products we use in that environment, our genetic, all that stuff just factors into it. It's not a nice, clean story, in other words.
Lots of variables. So like you said, demineralization is absolutely not perfect. So you don't necessarily lose specific teeth, portions of teeth in a certain way. It's not a methodical type thing. Is there any way for nano HAP to remineralize at all?
Yeah, so I think again, like I mentioned, the second phase, the second tack here, where it acts as a reservoir, and the reason why I believe that that could be a possibility is because that is one of the original reasons for using higher fluoride topical treatments to begin with. So over 50 years ago, plus they've actually captured, with I mentioned scanning electron microscopes and so there's evidence of calcium fluoride like globules that sit onto the tooth. You see, if fluoride can't get immediately integrated and it can't get cleared from the mouth, whether it's through spitting, rinsing with water, swallowed, or I don't know, however else it would get cleared, if it can get trapped in the plaque in between the teeth, like we talked about, it can form these clusters, these globules, and they can slowly release fluoride and calcium and phosphate over time during acidic events. And that would be the analog here to say, well, look, why can't nanohydroxyapatite also act as a reservoir? And it can. It just won't release fluoride. It'll release calcium and phosphate. And the calcium phosphate is fine, but again, the fluoride is what makes it more acid resistant to begin with. You're going to have a
Okay.
greater ability to withstand erosion. You're going to have a greater ability to withstand caries like attacks from the bacteria. That is one of the reasons why and how fluoride is used so well. It acts initially upon use and also has a sustained benefit. I think nanohydroxyapatite may really just have this sustained benefit. Is that good? It's something, right?
Right.
But that's the same, again, it's the same type of argument that you would use if you were to use anyway, like a fluoride-based therapy.
Okay, so if I'm understanding correctly, these globules of nano HAP are hanging around somewhere in the mouth, getting trapped, waiting for an acid attack. And that acid attack is going to break down the nano
Yep.
HAP, and then those calcium phosphate ions can integrate with the tooth.
Yes. Of course, the clearance of all that, it's gonna be based on various factors. We talked about that. What's your salivary flow? Did you eat right after? Whatever else.
Okay, basically all that means is any nano HAP that might be residing in the mouth potentially gets washed away or otherwise cleared.
Yep. And again, that's why fluoride is very ideal for remineralization.
It tends to stick around more.
Well, and not only that, it reacts immediately.
Yes.
And it cooperates with the calcium and phosphate coming out of saliva anyway.
Okay.
And that is what helps drive remineralization. If you don't have salivary flow, you cannot have effective remineralization. And that's why some people with xerostomia who just cannot salivate, they need additional sources of calcium and phosphate, whether that's in a rinse, whether that's in a toothpaste. but those should be more of an ionic form. You
Hmm.
know, if you want to really pull in the benefits immediately for that. But they can also be maybe insoluble, minerals like hydroxyapatite. But it would be better, if you have artificial saliva solutions, and they
Hmm.
do market these, especially, well, and even more so in Europe with calcium ions and phosphate ions, because they know that's what's driving the remineralization.
Okay. But nano HAP doesn't have any fluoride.
Nope.
So this means the enamel, even if it were to be repaired immediately, which isn't the case because it's not an ionic form, the nano
Yep.
HAP, or later, which there may be some truth to that,
Yep.
which is more susceptible to an acetate because it doesn't have fluoride, is what makes it susceptible. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. So it's just like, if they want to use the term that it like mimics our natural enamel, again, because it doesn't have fluoride, it's going to have the same susceptibilities to acid attack.
Okay.
So although our enamel's like carbonate apatite based and hydroxyapatite based, materials that they're pointing to put in the toothpaste, while that might seem like that's a good idea, and it is, again, it's a source of calcium and phosphate, but is it going to make your enamel stronger? The answer to that is no, and this has been proven time and time again. I mean, this is one of the original benefits of fluoride. Creates acid resistant mineral, so it pushes the ability of the enamel to have greater resistance than to becoming eroded, to becoming attacked by the microbes. That's the importance there.
Okay. So fluoride can react immediately, has
Hmm.
the ions that can react immediately. And bringing up that concept, how fast does nano HAP then work in the mouth?
Yeah, and this is all part of the craziness of the social media. I've seen ads where they say it acts immediately, right away. In fact, and they talk about calcium ions. It's funny. They'll say nanohydroxyapatite and it provides the calcium ions. And I'm thinking, but there are no calcium ions. At least not yet. It needs to be acidified. So unless you're having an acidic toothpaste, which they're not, then it's just not happening. So, it's really interesting because about 25 or so years ago, and this is kind of interesting, there was a push towards using a different form of calcium phosphate. They would called it amorphous calcium phosphate, and they had it as a topical treatment. In fact, the ADA, which has a research arm, actually created this, invented this, and they actually formed a company called Enamelon. It went public. It then went bankrupt, and then the rights to that technology were then licensed to Church and Dwight. And their technology was based on having two separate calcium and phosphate sources in two different chambers, and then you would dispense that at the same time by pushing down on the toothpaste. The perfect example of that would be Mentadent.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, there were two different chambers because calcium and phosphate, you need to keep them separate. Again, you want the ions to be doing the action. You can't have insoluble calcium phosphate sitting in there. And you sure as heck can combine calcium and fluoride in the same aqueous chamber because calcium will react with the fluoride prematurely, and then it's going to reduce the amount of fluoride available to the enamel whenever you actually do dispense it to your toothbrush and then begin brushing. You have to keep that separate. And so they were hoping that they could do that. And as this work, it's very original, right? It was very original, and they were saying, hey, it can maybe get into the gaps and defects. Well, at least it can then react, but ultimately you're forming a reservoir, and that's what they were hoping for. So there was a lot of work even before they launched their toothpaste that showed that amorphous calcium phosphate actually comes together and it starts forming a very young crystal as early as 6 minutes. And that sounds great, right? 6 minutes, but it's the original fuzzy form. It's not, clearly defined, doesn't have necessarily the sharp, refined edges of a mature crystal, which usually takes almost an hour to form. And that's under physiological only pH conditions, but that is, absent of any other factor, like if you have proteins present or carbonates present, or, if your salivary flow is high or low.
Okay,
So
but
that's
young HAP is formed from calcium phosphate ions in about 6 minutes. but it turns into a fully formed HAP in about an hour.
Yes, but realize, all those studies were done in a controlled laboratory setting, like I said. I mean,
Ideal situation.
ideal situation. They didn't have all these carbonates. They didn't have any other ions, in fact. They didn't have things like potassium or sodium, and that can also change the ionic strength and also impart some different factors that play into how quickly and what the cleanliness, if you will, of that mineralization looks like. And if you have fluoride present, man, that changes everything. So that can really accelerate that ripening, if you will. It can either lead to certain phases being formed, maybe, because really it's like a step process. If it starts from this initial tiny crystal and it matures, there could be, I don't know, two, three, four different calcium phosphate phases that are traversed as it goes from this initial
As it
tiny young
matures.
seed into a mature crystal. Yeah, so fluoride does great at accelerating that. And there's also some other tricks that some formulators can use in order to accelerate that transition and to form, dial in, skip all those different calcium phosphate phases. I've done this in my research and in some of my formulation efforts here. But we won't talk about that here. But that is the general feeling, right? Time wise, in terms of, well, what do you got? Starts in about 6 minutes, maybe goes an hour. That's under perfect conditions. Obviously,
Hmm.
it's not right. And that's another reason why if you're at the dentist and you get a fluoride treatment, they're like, okay, just wait. Don't eat or drink anything for 30 minutes after you get your fluoride varnish
Yes,
treatment or your
they always
gel
tell you
treatment
that.
or whatever it is. So, I mean, that's just what it is. So, but some dump fluoride quickly, some of those treatments that the dentist provides,
Hmm.
some dump more slowly. It all depends on the purpose of the formulation and what it's meant to do.
Okay, so then how does this ACP you previously mentioned compare to nano HAP?
Yeah, so the ACP, which would be the amorphous calcium phosphate, any inkling of that within the first 6 minutes, that's really the first indication that you're having any remineralization. In truth, when our calcium and phosphate from our saliva, from when those ions come together at our tooth, they're also forming this amorphous calcium phosphate like structure. Again, it's just the initial seed, the first leg of getting to that apatite integration into your tooth
The
structure.
early stages.
Yep. So it's the initial building block, and it's not yet fully HAP like, but it's going to get there. Just takes more time.
Okay, you're telling me that perhaps nano HAP for cleaning and whitening,
Hmm.
maybe,
Hmm.
but definitely not remineralization. What about sensitivity? Could nano HAP be an option?
Yes, and I envision this in two different ways, actually. So first, by physically blocking the source of where that sensitivity is there. So sometimes with root sensitivity, you'll actually have an open tubule. You have dentin tubules that are underneath, right, the enamel surface. And in certain instances, especially below our gum line, or if there's receding gums or whatever be the case, and sometimes people can just have sensitivity to even without that. Generally, you're going to have nerves that are going to be triggered by changes in fluid pressure that occur naturally within that dentin fluid, and things that are penetrating through the enamel. Sometimes people talk about in a whitening treatment, maybe they'll get sensitivity, and usually that's from some of the oxygen that is formed due to the degradation of the peroxide molecule. Anyway, some of that can, some of that gas change or gas evolution can actually impart some different fluid changes. And there's some different nuances there. Some people have the sensitivity, some people don't. But if you actually had an opening, where you had an opportunity to plug it, yes, that could be one way because these HAP are insoluble particles, right? So that's one way. The other way is let's use the reservoir system where it's going to take some time for the HAP under acid attack that would come about elsewhere.
It's out first.
Yeah, it has to get trapped, and then calcium phosphate ions would be released, and then they would reprecipitate and try to integrate actually with the dental tissue. The dentin can still be mineralized, and maybe that's how the sensitivity could be released. With that, but with any of these products, or treatments, sometimes it would take multiple uses. It's not like you're using potassium nitrate. The potassium nitrate agent for sensitivity immediately numbs that, that nerve, right? And
Okay.
so that's how that works. So it doesn't really block it in terms of a physical block. It's more of a chemical block, and it's just
The
blocking
potassium
the
nitrate.
signaling. Yep, the potassium nitrate. But so
Okay.
the HAP, if it's going to work for sensitivity from that perspective, it's going to do it by physical blocking or dissolving over time, releasing the ions that will eventually make it and mineralize with the two structure to have actually, for the relief of sensitivity. Similar to the remineralization second way, if we were to believe that it's going to drive
Right.
remineralization.
Right. Okay. But in as many instances, a product that might not work for one person
Absolutely. Yep.
might work for another. For me, many prescription products failed to reduce my sensitivity. One of the toothpaste you helped create is the first and only product that completely eliminated my tooth pain. As you know, I don't use, not just my love for you, but I don't use any other toothpaste.
Yeah, that's right.
So what do you recommend for a use, or where should nano HAP be used?
Well, I will tell you that more so in the part two of this discussion. But for now, this wraps up this part. I think that this is a great place to stop, actually, the part one, right? We have addressed a little bit, do you think it maybe has a place for abrasivity? Yeah, probably. In whitening,
Hmm.
absolutely. Maybe some sensitivity, for remineralization, maybe. Not immediately. So you can't expect it to work as a fluoride toothpaste does immediately upon brushing. It might have more of a benefit as a sustained kind of way to have additional calcium phosphate for remineralization, but honestly, I would say no. If you're using it primarily for remineralization, HAP is not going to get it done. The only other issue would be maybe if you have xerostomia and you're looking for a longer lasting source of calcium and phosphate that maybe these artificial salivas can't give you. So I think that's a pretty fair diplomatic approach to this and saying, hey, it might work, But
It has its
it
place,
has its place,
just
absolutely,
not in replacing fluoride
just
for
not in replacing
remineralization.
fluoride, and we will certainly talk about that. But that's another thing. If somebody wants to use it as a training toothpaste for their kid, right? They're worried about swallowing and stuff. Well, if there is an issue and where the kid wants to continue to eat toothpaste, well, then sure, use this and say, hey, no, that's not how you use a toothpaste. A toothpaste isn't candy. I know
Right.
it might smell like it might have nice, characteristics, but it's not candy. And until they learn that, if you
Hmm.
need to be on a HAP toothpaste to just make sure that they're not doing bad,
To be safe.
then that's fine. But then there's other problems because generally there's going to be other ingredients in these toothpaste that you do not want to swallow. Not that they're necessarily bad for you, but they're definitely not necessarily healthful for you. And we will talk about some example formulations in part two.
Looking
So,
forward to it.
so for now, that wraps this up. Thanks for listening to this episode. Make sure you catch the part two. That's going to come right up. Take a break. We're going to take a break and we'll be right back. Thanks for listening to Dental Formulators Playbook. Bye
Thank you.
bye.